So good morning, everybody. I'm Lonnie. Good morning. Again, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
It's my pleasure.
I'm going to kick off just by asking you, a little bit about your background. So, not to give too much information, but you grew up as a child of the 50s and the 60s. And
That means I'm old as dirt.
Not at all. And your parents were school teachers.
Teachers, yes.
So how did them, as school teachers, influence you to become an educator and a historian?
I think that the joy of growing up with two teachers is they instill in you a sense of learning and the importance of learning, the importance of reading. And I grew up in a town that was overwhelmingly Italian. There were very few African Americans, so I grew up speaking Sicilian. I can still curse really well. But I think what I realized is that through them, they helped me understand how by looking at history, thinking about education, not only could I understand about the broader society, but I could understand about the world I was facing, trying to understand how race shaped my own life and how they ended up in this little town. So for me, working with them was really about just being curious and trying to figure ways how to use education to help make a country better.
Got it. That's okay. So you've had a bit of a career, to be sure, heading into your current role. But in 2005, you were sort of given the reins of becoming the first and founding lead for the now National Museum of African American History and Culture. So tell us a little bit about that journey. So 2005, I don't even think there was a hole in the ground. There was a thought, there was a wish, there was a hope. And now 2016, September, you opened to an amazing fanfare and continue to still be, I think, the most popular, if not the most popular museum in the Smithsonian portfolio. So take us through that journey.
Well, I think it's important to realize that the museum I'm now running is my third Smithsonian museum, right? So I'm a lifer. I started out at the Air and Space Museum, then I was at American History, and that's so important because that was really how we were able to get it done. If I really hadn't been of the Smithsonian, it would take another 20 years. And I think the reality was I cannot remember why I said yes. Okay? I mean, when you think about it, is the Smithsonian called me. I had left to become the president of the Chicago Historical Society, and the Smithsonian said, "Would you come back?" And I said, "Well, what do we have?" And they said, "Well, you have no staff, no building, no site, no collections, no money." And I said, "Well, what do I got?" They said, "You got a dream." And so in a way, the notion was, how do you take something that had been floating around as an idea for 100 years, how do you make it real? So the notion in my mind was the museum had to exist. It couldn't be a project, it couldn't be an initiative. And really where that came from was Mayor Daley. When I was leaving Chicago, Mayor Daley called me into his office and he basically beat me up. Why are you leaving, going to he kept calling it a one-horse company town called Washington. And then he said, why do you want to run a project? And that convinced me that the only way this was going to work is if we could really get people to believe that it existed from the day we started. So part of the challenge was, how do you figure out, how do you build a national museum, right? There are very few models. How do you build a national museum that talks about race, issues that have divided us? And how do you build a national museum at a time when traditionally in the Smithsonian, museums are built by federal money? This one had to be a 50-50 private partnership, public-private partnership. So all of those were things that really shaped how we did this. Ultimately, I just believed that we owed a century of people who wanted, who fought for, who believed this museum should be there. And I would keep going back to that as my reservoir. Whatever we faced, I said, we're fulfilling these dreams. Let's figure out how to get this done. And so, as I always say, the story that I really do love about beginning this is that the Smithsonian said to me, we're going to give you offices in L'Enfant Plaza. And so I went to L'Enfant Plaza to get to my offices and the doors were locked. So I went to the security and I said, "Excuse me, I'm Lonnie Bunch, the new director." And they said, "We don't know who you are." So I'm knocking on all these doors and nobody will let me in. So I'm standing there with my one staff, feeling like, why did I say yes? And then a maintenance guy came by in his cart, and he had a crowbar. So I broke into my offices. And so to me, that was the metaphor for what we were to do. Nobody was ready for this, not even us. And I think that was the sort of beginning of that. I still have the crowbar. And that now that is more than anything else is my Jersey upbringing. Okay, I just want to do that.
So it sounds like everybody has that same first day. You didn't bring it to your office. So on your board, you know, you've got names like Ken Chenault, Oprah Winfrey, Colin Powell, Laura Bush, among others. So a lot of high power. I would imagine there might be an ego or two in the room. So how do you coalesce that to actually, again, put the hole in the ground and put the museum there?
I've done this job living with fear. And I was in Chicago, and they asked me to come back to go to a board meeting before I started work. So it was June of 2005. So I walk in, and I know who these people are, but I don't know them. And they put me between Dick Parsons, the head of Time Warner, Oprah Winfrey, and Bob Johnson across from me. And I'm thinking, what the heck? It's a long way from Jersey. And so I think that part of the challenge for me was, to be honest, I was terrified. And the former head of the Smithsonian, a man named Larry Small, said something that really helped me. He said, you're intimidated, but realize this, that in your field, you're as high up as they are in their field, and that they want to be with you because they want to build this museum. And that was so helpful. So part of the way to sort of gather all these egos was to say, we're doing this for the greater good. And what I was so in touch with is that of the board, 99% stayed with me for over 10 years. And so people put their egos aside for the greater good. Now, I'm not going to deny there weren't moments where they would say, well, why aren't you moving faster? I said, because you've got 5,000 employees, I have 2. But I think the reality was everybody sort of said, this is about something more important than who we are, and let's come together and make it work.
Okay. And so now in your experience, you know, you've been the first a few times.
Yeah.
So is that important to you?
Yes, it is. To be perfectly honest, as you can imagine, the museum field is, when I started, was awash with whiteness, okay? And so the notion of being, when I started at the Smithsonian, there were 3 black curators in the whole Smithsonian. And 2 of us were at the Air and Space Museum. One was a fighter pilot, so they loved him and me. And so the notion of changing a profession, of helping museums become more than places of nostalgia, but places that help people grapple with the worlds that they're wrestling with now, to help museums recognize that there should be as much about today and tomorrow as there are about yesterday. So for me, the notion of changing a profession, of opening doors, is really the most important thing. And so part of what I felt strongly about is that when they asked me to come to Chicago to run the museum, I turned them down. I mean, I'm at the Smithsonian, I'm happy, and they did something really smart. They actually had the mayor and the governor come talk to me about, if you could be successful in Chicago, a place with a tortured racial past, you can open more doors for other people. That's what's always been the thing that's motivated me in my career.
So I'm going to tease on this a little bit. So I lived in Chicago for 10 years.
Okay.
And I've been in the office of Mayor Daley when he wasn't
Then
particularly
you know,
pleased.
right?
So I know what that's all about. These guys, it's just trust me, you don't want to be there. So Chicago does have that bit of a past. And right now, you know, you've served at the pleasure of a couple of presidents, a Republican and a Democrat. So what does Chicago teach us about the conversation that we might need to be having in this country to kind of narrow the divide we find ourselves in?
I think first, Chicago teaches us that the success of a city is dependent on interaction among the political community, the cultural community, and the business community. I have never been in a place that really felt that was crucial. Those 3 sort of legs to the stool had to be there. And I want to answer your question, but let me give you one quick example about that. I was very involved in all the sort of creation of Chicago 2020 and the Economic Club of Chicago. So I came back to DC and transferred my membership to the Economic Club of DC. So I came to my first meeting and I'm sitting around the table and everybody's introducing themselves. So I say who I am, and somebody stands up and says, "What's a culture guy doing in the DC Economic Club?" That would have never happened in Chicago, right? And so for me, it was both that, but also Chicago has been a place where the city has been torn by race, but also the city has been brought together around issues of race. And so Chicago's history, Chicago's sense of what is possible, is really something that has inspired me. And Chicago is also a lab, because, you know, the violence in Chicago is violence in other places. So for me, if you could help Chicago wrestle with who it is, then I think you can help other cities as well. Plus, it was so cold in Chicago. My goodness. I never want to do that again.
Wow. So you think that between the business community, the cultural community, the government, there's a conversation, but who leads?
I think that's really the challenge, right? What I was struck by in Chicago was the business community led that.
Okay.
The business community realized that this city needs that, all three, in order to be the place it wants to be. When Mayor Daley went after Boeing to get the headquarters to come to Chicago, he asked me to be the co-chair of the committee because he thought that culture was so important to that argument. And so what I really hope that in places like DC, we can really have those kind of conversations, because I think that I would argue that I was in Davos last year, and one of the things I was struck by in Davos is this desire to use the business community to help transform a world. But you're missing one of the most important legs, that's culture. And so without tapping museums and the folks that do culture, you're really fighting a battle with one arm tied behind your back. And so I really believe that it's the responsibility of all of us in the cultural community, in the business community, to find ways that we leverage each other and that we recognize that's the way we transform a community.
Got it. So I'm going to go just a touch deeper on this point, because I think it's a really good point. So, and I'm going to admit something about myself. So I've lived in DC now since 2010. And I can remember the first day I drove into DC, I saw the Washington Monument, and I saw the Jefferson and Lincoln. I thought, I cannot wait to go and kind of breathe that in. And Smithsonian, I have not done that. And I talked to a lot of people who come to this area, a very transient area in general, and they all sort of had that same experience. So how do we draw people into this cultural resource that is just embedded in the firmament of the city?
I think it's partly the Smithsonian's challenge, right? That the Smithsonian, okay, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but the Smithsonian often forgets it's in DC. And the fact that it serves such a national, international audience, that it doesn't take care of home. And so part of my strategy is to make sure that we have a DC initiative. You know, whether it's education, whether it's making sure that the money we spend, a portion of it stays in DC. So I think part of it is that challenge from the Smithsonian. The other challenge is for us to have conversations like this, that people begin to think about the museums as more than ancillary moments, more than places of escape, but are essential to the glue that holds a community together. And so I think it's really this kind of education to say, here is a resource that you're not tapping. And how do we do that? What is it? How does that make us better as a community?
Got it. So well, let me pivot a little bit. So one of the other things that you've done in your career to this point is you've been a prolific writer.
Yes.
And one of your books is what you call it, the American Presidency, the Glorious Burden. So from a historian's perspective, not in thinking about what's going on today, but in a historian's perspective, what's the best type of person to take on that burden?
Let's just say that we've had about 50% of the presidents that actually know how to do that. I would say that what you're looking for, what the best presidents have historically, is a vision of an America that's different than the America they're in. And they also have a nimbleness to sort of understand that it's not about them, that it's about leveraging the people around. okay, you guys take it where you think you want to go.
What is good?
You know, I'm just a poor historian. But I think it's that notion of the greater good, and it's also recognizing the best presidents are people that handle pressure in a certain way. Most of the people that we identify as great presidents went through war, depression, but they figured out ways to find solutions. But maybe most importantly, every great president was a great communicator. Was really able to get people to believe when they shouldn't have believed. And that to me is really one of the great skills of leadership.
So do you draw a distinction between American leadership and leadership across the world? Like, is there a real difference?
Well, I think, you know, as an American scholar, that's where I go first, right? But I really do think that as I look at people around the world, historically and contemporary, I see the same things, the same issues of leadership. Who do you surround yourself with? What's the ability to focus on what is your own country, your own community, and then the ability to sort of go beyond that. I think that's a challenge. I always think, to me, the best definition of leadership I ever heard was from Napoleon. And Napoleon said that the best leaders are people that define reality and give hope. And to me, that's what I really think is, in my own leadership, that's what I try to do.
And so in this world that we live in today that has gotten just smaller and smaller, in your view, is it America's responsibility to lead, or do you think there's more of a global view, if you will, of leadership coming from a variety of different places?
I think that it's crucial to recognize that America plays a leadership role, but it's a different kind of leadership. It used to be, here's what the history of civilization in a way is: whoever is the most powerful gets to lead. And then until they fall from favor, they influence everything globally. I would argue that what we now have is a kind of first among equals, a sense that America still is seen in many ways as a model of possibility. And so we don't want to lose that. We need to recognize that that's got to be shaped and shared. That in some ways, the way things like NATO work are really the better models when it works well. And that's what I think we need to look towards.
Got it. All right, let me pivot back to the museum a little bit, and then I'm going to open it up to folks in the audience to ask questions, and we don't have generally a shy group. So, so the African American History and Cultural Museum has such a powerful message. I've been over there a number of times, and I still haven't gotten through a third of it. We recently had a group of our employees go over and spend the entire day on a guided tour, and I don't think they got past the second floor. So there's a deep, rich message that you've built with your colleagues over there. What advice would you give to people who really want to experience the museum sort of through the eyes of a curator, and in a way that they get the message of that richness?
Well, you know, when we crafted the museum, we thought about it very differently than other museums. Other museums, by their nature, want you to glance through. What I really felt that issues of race, African American culture, are central to all of us, and so I really wanted to make it a deep experience. And so I would argue that if I'm going through in a cursory ray, what I would do is I would just stop at the big artifacts, right? I would look at that slave cabin, because that slave cabin tells so many stories, for example. While it tells the story of slavery and how people lived, one of the things you'll look at, the cabin that we have has 2 doors. When it was a slave cabin, there was only 1 door, so the master could control entrance and exit. As soon as freedom came, they put a second door in. So for me, that door is a concrete manifestation of saying, I'm different. So there are things like that that'll give you a kind of sense of both a culture, but also of a nation. But I also think the reality is that this is like a 500-page book. You can skip the chapters, but at some point you got to sit down and really wrestle with it, and that's what we tried to do.
Okay. All right, audience, who has a question? Do we have a microphone? Okay. Go ahead and Terry.
Thank you. Mr. Bunch, first of all, thank you for your service. Lonnie, thank you for your service. So in that, I'm very curious, in that journey from 2005 to 2016, there had to be at least one, maybe 3 occasions where you were just like, I can't do this anymore. Like, it's not happening fast enough, I'm losing my hope. Can you describe, if that did happen, can you describe that experience and how you got past it?
I've always felt that at 8 o'clock in the morning, I had the best job in America. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's the stupidest thing I've ever done, okay? So there were many of those moments where I thought, to be honest, I thought the greatest weakness of the museum was whether I was good enough or not, right? Because the notion of, first of all, doing a national museum, but then doing something that would make all our ancestors proud, put that additional burden on. And then, to be honest, we were, unlike other museums, that had collections already. I described this as, it was like going on a cruise at the same time you're building the ship. And so there was a lot of moments. I think that some of the worst sleepless nights were picking an architect, right? Because on the one hand, it's the federal government. So you want the best architects in the world, but you also think about there are very limited opportunities for African American architects, especially to do something on the mall. So how do you craft it so you get the best architects? And so coming up with a strategy of saying it's got to be a team of people, and you've got to demonstrate an understanding of African American culture, but wrestling with that and thinking about the architects. And the best example is the architects we chose. They were my second choice. Okay, my first choice was an amazing architect from another country, and I said to him, I said, okay, so you're really good, but we're gonna be dancing for 7 years. How do we fight? Tell me how we fight. And he said to me, the architect wins. I said, you're gone. So hit the Jersey Turnpike because you're out of here. So I think trying to figure out the architect was tough. And the other thing was 2008, right, when the economy fell apart, that we had to raise over $300 million. That's a lot of money, okay? And so part of it was that, candidly, the Smithsonian wanted this to happen, but if it didn't happen, that was okay. And I'm smart enough to know that they hired me in part because if it failed, they at least had somebody who knew they made the greatest effort. And so there was this real sense of, would this happen? And just as we get going, the economy falls apart. And those days were really tough. When suddenly I said, okay, we're going to raise $40 million. That's not going to happen. How do we do? So it was really trying to figure out what are the ways that you keep staff going, and what are the ways you make people believe this is going to happen. And so I think thinking about little victories, every step of the way, it was, how do I demonstrate this is going to be successful? So in 2008, when it fell apart, I said, who do I know? I helped bring Boeing to Chicago. So I said to Boeing, you got to help me. So during that crisis, Boeing gave $5 million. And that helped me say, yeah, we're not doing well, but we've got the possibility. So those are the kind of things.
Good morning, Lonnie. Thank you so much. Your words have been very inspirational. I wanted to ask about your position now, that I would call you the godfather of African American museums. And I say that because recently I was in Charleston, South Carolina, at Gadsden Landing, and met Mr. Michael Moore, who is working on the International African American Museum. And so, and I understand that you're helping to develop that museum as well. So I wanted to know if you could just, one, talk a little bit about that museum, but also how much pressure is being put on you now for the success of other museums like the Lynching Museum and others around the country that are developing as a result of your efforts.
I believe that my job is to make 1,000 flowers bloom, that to explore a variety of museums that wrestle with African American culture, not necessarily just African American museums, but wrestle with African American culture. And I believe that the Smithsonian's job, if we built a museum that was just successful in impact in Washington, then we failed. That what we needed to be was a place that drew people to Washington because it's the Smithsonian, like a beacon. But then we pushed them back to local museums to go see what they're doing in Charleston, to look at what's happening along the River Road in Baton Rouge, to really say that we can't tell every story, but you can find amazing stories in your community, in your hometown. So we've tried very hard to make that work. I think the thing that really has, I mean, this notion of the Godfather, being from Jersey, I got it, but I think that the thing that really has been the biggest surprise and the thing that's been most difficult for me has been my own visibility. I didn't expect that. I mean, I'm a historian. And so the notion of people coming up to me on the street and saying thank you, or asking why their cousin isn't in the museum. I mean, I think that was something I didn't expect. And so I take very seriously the responsibility of not just sort of wrestling with African American culture, but one of the most important things we've done is help America wrestle with history, is return history to a central place of helping us understand who we are. I take that very seriously, and that's been the most amazing part of this. But I must be honest, it's just really weird for me to be visible. I was flying back from Paris, and I'm waiting like everybody else, and this guy says, "I've seen you on 60 Minutes." Next guy says, "I saw you twice on 60 Minutes." You know. But anyway, so that's the weird part of it.
Carolyn, right there.
Hi. Thank you again for your service. I'm very curious with the topic of stories. What are the things that are top of mind now for developing future exhibits, and how are you thinking about that?
We thought very much that if you really go through the museum, you'll see several things. First of all, it's driven by stories. I literally would spend days talking to Oprah Winfrey years ago about storytelling. How do you engage an audience? What are the ways to do it? But the other thing that you'll see is the exhibits in the museum, by my design, are cinematic. That I really ask people, I ask them to think about movies, think about pacing, think about juxtaposition, think about pausing. So all of that went into shaping what the museum is. And the goal now is to figure out what are the stories we should tell that would help challenge America, right? What are the ways we use the museum, we use my writing in op-eds, for example, to sort of contextualize the contemporary issues we wrestle with. So in essence, what you'll see in the future is there'll always be that spine that's there, but you'll see us wrestle with either through exhibits, through programs, through writing. You'll see us try to contextualize America, to help people understand whether it's violence, whether it's Confederate monuments. And so that's a little different than a lot of other museums, because we really have, I'll say it, we have an activist bent. My notion is that if you engage the museum, you should first of all be changed. But more importantly, you should recognize that America is a work in progress and that it has been changed in dramatic ways by people who have made that commitment to demand America live up to its stated ideals. That is what I hope we do, is create new generations of people who understand it's not enough to be an American. You got to work at it to make a country live up to its ideals.
Again, thank you so very much. I had an opportunity to go to the museum, and as you said, I still have only probably done about 10% of what I need to do. And two things amaze me. First of all, when I look at who I see every time I go, I'm encouraged because of the diversity. I'm also encouraged at the kinds of conversations people want to have with you. And they really want to get to know you. I happen to be originally from Southern Virginia and a direct descendant of that horrific slavery lineage. And I'm glad you mentioned something about the Confederacy debate and so forth. My question would be, how do we help in a more informed way, expand in a meaningful way, the premise that some take around the Confederacy monuments is really about telling the other story of history, but when we look at it, those of us who've lived that experience know that there is a tremendous bent. How do you and we and the Smithsonian help expand that so that we become more engaging and not so more divisive? Thank you.
Well, I think the good news is discussions around Confederate monuments about contested history are really happening all around the country, right? And so part of what we've done is given people the freedom to do that. And I think that what we're really saying more than anything else, and maybe what I hope the museum also does, is most museums give simple answers to complex questions. What I want is a museum that helps the public embrace ambiguity. Because if you embrace ambiguity, then it's about the learning. It's about sort of realizing that there's not one answer to anything, and to realize that complexity is the way to understand who you are today. So that notion of looking at Confederate monuments, for example, is really important because it raises fundamental questions about who gets to own history, how do you remedy prior omissions, but how do you also honor stories that are important to different communities? My notion of Confederate monuments is pretty simple, which is I think that I have no problem celebrating the Confederacy if you honestly say Confederacy lost the war but won the peace, and that if you honestly say that the Confederacy lost, and so therefore if you frame it as going against the American way, then I can live with the way you want to talk about the Confederacy. If not, then we'll have the debates.
Thank you for being here. My question is really coming from your comment about helping 1,000 flowers bloom, and also connecting that to the experience you had of being one of only 3 African Americans in Smithsonian. So many of us in Leaders of Greater Washington, various sectors, are still looking at how we have programs, organizations, companies that have very few people of color, people of diverse backgrounds. I wonder how, in your leadership role now, having had that experience, the strategies or actions maybe you take to make change happen within an organization.
I think partly it was recognizing the power you really have. And so I said, when we started, I said, we are going to do several things differently than any other museum. We're going to have the most diverse staff in America. 40% of my staff is non-African American, 60% is. We were also going to have a staff that was diverse via age, and that I really basically said, I want this museum to model the America I believe in. And so what we've done is crafted an array of programs that allow us to bring the next generation of interns through. But what we do is, while we work with HBCU and others, we say you're doing this together. That we're not simply creating a path for African Americans. We say that part of what you want is to craft people so that you open up doors, but anybody that's here will have a different view because they've worked in this kind of environment. So we try very hard to do that. And as somebody said earlier, to me, the greatest thing I'm proudest of is that 40% of the visitors to the museum are non-African American. 25% of the visitors to the museum have never been to another museum in their lives. And for me, what is really more powerful is, in the Smithsonian, the average amount of time you spend in a museum is 1 hour and 15 minutes. Our hours on the weekday is 5 hours, and on weekend it's 6.5. So really trying to say that you can do things that are transformative. That's really what we've been trying to do.
Now, I'll throw in a little commercial here. I think I know that in September, you're going to open up the museum without timed passes. Is that right?
On weekdays.
On weekdays.
On weekdays. Yeah. I hate the notion of passes, but to be honest, the crowds are so great that you've got to worry about health and safety issues.
Yeah.
Good morning. Again, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for being a change agent. My question is, I want to go back to people asking you why my cousin isn't in the museum. So I know that you've gotten a lot of wonderful artifacts. I've seen them as I've visited. But how did you solicit artifacts, and then how did you determine which ones you would use and those that you chose not to use?
You know, we had to, because we had nothing, the biggest worry I had, my staff was worried about raising money. I figured that, I didn't worry about that. I worried about the collections. Because at the Smithsonian, if you had a museum driven simply by technology, it would fail. Because you go see the Wright Flyer, the Ruby Slipper, the Greensboro Lunch Counter. So my notion was, how do we build collections? So I remember being called to Congress and they said, well, you know, young man, can you find collections? And I lied, sure. You know, and so what I realized though is that I remember early in my career, I was collecting in California, and a woman said to me, I've got nothing. You know, why are you here? And I kept asking for things, and she said, nothing, nothing. And then she said, well, just go look in the garage. And it was an amazing treasure trove of stuff. So I realized that I had to believe that all the 20th century, most of the 19th century, even some of the 18th century, was still in basements, trunks, and attics. So I stole the idea from Antique Roadshow. We went around the country, we said, bring out your stuff. We helped you preserve grandma's old shawl, that 19th century photograph. People would say, oh, well, we want to give this to you. Well, the first thing we'd say is, give it to local museums first. So it didn't look like we were coming in taking everything. But if it was, in the scholarly parlance, really cool, came back to and so we collected over 40,000 artifacts, of which 70% came from basements, trunks, and attics in people's homes. And so that, to me, is one of the things I'm proudest of, because it's not only what we collected, it's the conversations in Charleston, and Detroit, and LA, and other people are now making sure that they're preserving that unbelievably important cultural patrimony.
You were on TV last night, or on the news last night, talking about the Emmett Till investigation. You want to say a couple words about that, and then we'll...
One of the things that I learned in Chicago was, one of my best buddies in Chicago was Studs Terkel, the great oral historian. And Studs would come into my office and he'd say, Lonnie, who do you want to meet? And I said, well, I'd love to meet Emmett Till's mother. So he brought her into my office before she died, Mamie Till Mobley, and we were going to have an hour lunch. She spent 7 hours talking about everything that happened from the time she kissed her son goodbye until the time she buried her son. And I was so taken by her, I wrote some articles about her, and we became friends. And she passed, I came back here, and I always knew I had to do something on Emmett Till, not because of the story of Emmett Till, but because of his mother, who said to me that she carried the burden of Emmett Till for 50 years. Now it's my turn. And so I felt very strongly about that. And then when the family, you know, the story, the casket was, Emmett was disinterred at the first investigation. He was reburied in a new casket. The old casket was supposed to be taken care of at a cemetery in a pristine way. It wasn't. It was thrown into a shed. Raccoons were living in it. The family called me, and I thought, do I take a casket? But I realized, as she said to me, the bravest thing she did was open that casket so the world would see what they did to her son. So that's why we took it, and that's why we did the exhibition. And so then when they announced, DOJ announced this new reopening, I mean, I have no idea why they've done it, but I think the reality is there is nothing more powerful than really understanding completely what happened in the past. And if we can sort of not only help the family ease their pain, but help America ease its pain, then this reinvestigation is really interesting and important. Now, why it's being done, is it a ploy? I mean, there are all those issues, but my notion is I will take people at what they say, and let's hope there's new information that can help us understand the story.
And so thank you again for being here, and certainly for the museum. One of the things that I think I'm hearing everyone talk about is not only the opportunity for conversation in the museum and the diversity in the museum, but one of the things that I find as a highlight is the conversation that goes on in the restaurant area. Whose brainchild was that? Because in most museums, you go in and you might find cafeteria, but you don't really spend any time there. And what I see is children, babies, families, and across the tables, it's just a great opportunity for conversation, and the conversations are always live.
It was my idea. You know, basically, yeah, really, yeah. Yes, I mean, basically, what I realized is, you know, working in the Smithsonian, I realized that you pay $15 for bad hamburgers, so why not pay $15 for shrimp and grits? And then I stole the idea from the Indian Museum. The Indian Museum had all this regional cuisine, and I thought, that's another way. What I was trying to do is figure out, how do I make the interpretation of culture embedded in every part of the museum? And so I wanted the cafeteria, the restaurant, the cafe, to really do that. And so we thought about regional cuisine, but I said, but it's got to be really good. And so we hired amazing chefs, and we also designed it family style, so that you got to talk to people. We don't have a lot of little tables. I wanted to demand that. And then my youngest daughter, who was much smarter than me, said, you've got to also put in a few lunch counters. You've got to give people that sense of the, so that's where that, she said, do it, and I said, okay, fine. And so I think what you really see is it's just an extension of the museum giving people an opportunity to engage and rest, because the museum does stress you. And so I figured if we're going to stress you, get, you know, eat. As we say in North Jersey, mind you that.
So you talked about the concept of when you expected the position to come back to DC, taking the concept of the museum from project into the I can't remember when the Holocaust Museum opened, but one, I don't know if that's part of the Smithsonian.
It's not, it's tied to the federal government.
Okay. So my question was, my question is, when that museum opened, I heard a lot of people saying, wow, you know, Jewish people come together and open that museum, was happy with the African American people. So did that museum opening help drive the African American Museum opening faster?
No. That where the Holocaust Museum was a good model was that the Holocaust Museum took 15 years. And so the notion of, I was trying to get this done in 10 years. So that was a model to me of how can I push the federal government to move more quickly. The Holocaust Museum is also a great model because they explored difficult issues when no other museum did. And I think that for me, that was very instructive. The other thing the Holocaust Museum does brilliantly that we're stealing is working with the police department, the FBI, using it as training. The difference, the fundamental difference is, because people said to me, well, the Holocaust Museum's done it, so you can do it. The fundamental difference is that in the Holocaust Museum, the bad guys aren't American. And the notion of wrestling with America's culpability is one of the fundamental differences between this and the Holocaust Museum, and that's really what's changed it. Now, we work with the Holocaust Museum, we do a lot together, but no, it really wasn't a model. I mean, to be honest, this museum only came to fruition, and you gotta remember, they've been trying to do this since 1915. And it was always first a Republican project, then a Democratic project, and it really wasn't until Mickey Leland from Texas and John Lewis got together with people like Sam Brownback from Kansas and said, how do we do something that crosses both sides of the aisle? And that's how they were able to get it through, because they recognized that by the 2000s, the civil rights generation, which was the one area where everybody could agree, it was a kind of feel-good moment, that generation was passing from the scene. So how do we preserve that in a museum? And that in essence, by being bipartisan and then having George W. Bush sign it, it really candidly helped me get it done. because I was able to say to people who didn't support this, I'd say, but the Republican president signed it. It is not a Democratic issue. And that was really hard, because when I would walk on the Hill, they'd see this face and they'd go Democrat. So to be able to say that George Bush was really supportive of it, it really did help us get this through.
So I my thanks to those of my colleagues that are here. Thanks for not giving up. You mentioned that you honor the stories of different communities, and I also thank you for that. I had the opportunity to attend the opening with Julius Garvey, the son of Marcus Garvey, and watched as his face went through different periods. And I want to thank you, because right now many of our colleagues and the children of the next generation of the Caribbean community are now learning about Marcus Garvey again. And because of that, we want to thank you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I think that this museum had to be international in scope. It had to focus on America, but it had to be international. One of the big projects I've got people working on in the future is to wrestle with what does it mean that in the last 30 years, more Africans have come to the United States than during the entire slave trade. Does that change what African American means? So really trying to think about important contemporary issues that we can look through the lens of history.
Hi, Michelle Tackle, City of Washington, D.C. So I work with a lot of young people, 17 to 25-year-olds. I'm guessing that everybody in this room has young people in their lives. So as this next generation is kind of grappling with history and figuring out their way in the world, what advice do you have for them?
I think that what we've done, we did a lot of surveys, trying to understand different audiences, and I use my own kids. And so I think part of it is to recognize that there is this amazing curiosity about who they are and what has shaped them. And so what we've done is really taken on social media, taking on the tools that they use as a way to introduce them to artifacts, to the past. Because what we found is that millennial kids, they were really interested in saying, we have lived our life in the virtual. We've really not thought about the actual. And so what we've done is use their platforms to introduce them to the authentic. And the amazing sense of how these young kids are really engaged with saying, is that really Nat Turner's Bible? And so basically by crafting programs on the platforms that they know, I'm now, well-versed, or at least I have 12-year-olds on my staff that are well-versed, that can have those communications that help us do that.
Hello, my name is Kimberly Memphis. Honored to be in your presence. And I'm just so fascinated by that museum. And the lady right there kind of stole my thunder. I was going to ask a question about, she asked a question about the artifacts, but I find it so fascinating how it's designed. How did you think to do that? How did you think to design everything and put everything, the big things and the small things? How did you do that?
I mean, I think that's what I know how to do, right? I mean, I'm a museum guy. And so what we said was that there were really two elements. One, what's the building look like? And then how do we make sure that the building works as a museum? And then what are the notions that the exhibition should look like, right? And so let me talk about the building first. So obviously it doesn't look like anything else on the mall. That was a conscious decision, okay? And so, but what I really wanted, and there are two creation stories of the museum. From the architect's point of view, it was shaped by a West African Yoruba post that gave that sort of three-tier shape. My sense was, the reason I liked the shape was that I saw a picture from the 1920s of black women who's in prayer and their hands were at that angle. And so I really loved that angle because I said, I want a building that speaks of spirituality, uplift, and resiliency. And that angle is what did that. The other thing is, okay, for those of you that know the joy of regulatory agencies in Washington, there was this whole notion of, my God, how do you build on the mall? Are you going to make people, you're going to get in the way of the view lines of the Washington Monument? So the angle of the building is 17 degrees. which is the angle at the top of the Washington Monument. So for regulatory agencies, I talk about how the buildings sing to each other. It worked. And I think the other thing about the building, let me just finish that, is that this is the first green museum on the mall, right? It's really important to me to have a sustainable museum, right? And so the Corona, the bronze tier, is what helps us be green. But the architects realized that you can't have this solid bronze, so they wanted to just punch holes in it. And I said, we're not going to do that. So I went down to Charleston and New Orleans and took pictures of all that ironwork that enslaved craftspeople made, and that's what's on the entire building. So the building is a homage to the fact that so much of what is built in America has been built by people who will never know who they are. So that's my way of acknowledging them. And within the exhibitions, thank you, it really was a sense of how do we do something that is a sense of drama? How do we make sure that we humanize the stories? If you go through the museum, you'll see more quotations, you'll hear more people's voices than most museums, because I said the most important thing we can do is reduce history to human scale. I don't want you to get so caught up in that there were 15 million people lost in the international slave trade. I want you to look at one ship, and I want you to think about what that meant. So that was one of the guiding principles. And then it really was thinking about how do you craft, we did something I've never done. This is the first time in my entire career that we did an exhibition, a history guys, where you start and you got to follow one path. I've never done that. But I really felt that people needed the narrative. People needed to understand this story. And so that's why we made some of those decisions. So we are fortunate to have amazing staff who could come up with these great ideas and really implement it. And I'm very proud that we tried to do what was the most important thing we could do for a 21st century museum. Not for the Smithsonian, not for African American. What is the best thing you can do as a 21st century museum? And that's what led to the design.
Hello. First of all, let me say thank you for your contribution to our history, to American history. For me, the museum was just a very transformative experience. And so I'm wondering, how did you find the balance in the fact that our history in America is so entrenched in slavery to not make the museum necessarily about slavery? Of course, this is not all that we've contributed, but to honor that with the mile-long walk. I've been on a walk a couple times, but to honor that in a way that's reflective of reality, but also not a determiner of where we're going. As the levels go up, I found more and more hope, and was happy by the end, but still felt conflicted. So I was wondering how you found that balance.
The word I always use is tension. I'm in search of tension. Tension between moments that will make you cry as you ponder the pain of slavery and segregation, and moments where you'll find resiliency and what I think is at the heart of the African American community, hope. And so that really was something when we did almost every exhibition, I said, let's talk about that tension. How do we play that out? I also felt, because we did 2 years of audience surveys and focus groups and discussions around the country, really around the globe, and one of the things that was so interesting is the number one thing people didn't want to talk about was slavery. And the number one thing they wanted to talk about was slavery. And so I really felt that we needed to begin and give you that firm grounding, because for 2 reasons. One is people said to me, slavery is an African American story. It isn't. It's the story that profoundly shaped who we are, our economics, our culture, our politics. But secondly, I had many African Americans say to me that slavery was embarrassing. I'll never forget, on a Sunday I was in the Giant near where I live, and there was this wonderful, woman with her church hat and everything. First of all, saying why wasn't I in church, but that's another conversation. And she said to me, I want to hug you. And she hugged me and said, I want to thank you, but please don't talk about slavery. And so I knew that I wanted people to grapple with that, because I think it was really important. For me, the story of slavery is, yes, it's a story of pain, and it's a story, but it's a story of an amazing sense of resiliency. I wish I was as strong as my enslaved ancestors. If we were as strong as those folks as a country, boy, where we'd be. And so that's what I ultimately wanted people to understand.
You just talked about the pain of slavery, which I think is somewhat obvious, but then also the pain of segregation. And here in the last week, there was a school, I think it was in New Jersey, that made an active decision to segregate their classrooms in the school. Why do we continue to kind of come back around this arc to that place of separating along racial lines? Like, what's your perspective on why we do that?
I think in some ways, separating along, whether it's racial or gender lines, is an easy answer, right, to people. There's a problem. If we just do that, we can solve that problem, right? I mean, I think that the segregation was really an extension of slavery, a way to control people. And I think that anybody that's experienced it, you realize what a scar that leaves on you, right? And so I think for me, you know, and again, I'm a kid of the 50s and 60s, I'm an integrationist, right? I'm a firm believer that the kids I went to school with are different because I was in their presence, right? And I'm different because I had to fight every day. But I think the reality is that segregation often gets undervalued in terms of its impact, in terms of its legacy. And so I wanted people to understand that slavery is not that long ago, and segregation is still happening.
Yeah.
My name is Peter Rosenstein. Again, thank you for what you have done and the contribution. But I'd like to take you back to what you said about being part of DC. Having begun my career as a teacher in Harlem, New York, and now being an activist in local government, you're absolutely right that there is a disconnect about what culture brings to our economy. In DC, it's over $1 billion a year, and that's not recognized. But my question is how you can have an impact on not only that, but on young people in DC. My vision would be that no student can graduate DC high school without having been either to your museum, the Holocaust Museum, and that there needs to be a curriculum within our schools about that. Is there a way that you can contribute to that? Is there a way that you can impact? We're going to have a new chancellor in DC shortly, to make that part of what we do for the children of the district.
We're creating what I'm calling the DC Initiative, which looks at it on many different levels. And I think that really looking at what kind of curricula we do, what are the programs we do with the district, what are the ways we help teachers get rejuvenated. So those are all things we're looking at, and we just continue to have the conversations. The great strength of the museum is that building will be there as long as there's an America. So we have now the opportunity to really expand in ways that we hadn't thought about.
Last question.
Yeah, I'm a Yankee fan. Okay, let's be
My name is Tamara Wells-Lawson. And as a driving force behind this wonderful edifice and everything that's in it, you spent years focusing on making it possible. So now that it's here and flourishing, what are one or two things that might keep you up at night, or that you're worried about as a leader of this wonderful museum?
One is candidly figuring out what do I do when I grow up? You know, because one of the challenges of leadership is knowing when to go, right? Because I've cast such a shadow on this. I don't want that to be the legacy. I don't want my shadow to be the legacy. So I wrestle a lot with, you know, how long do I stay? I love what I'm doing. I could stay at the Smithsonian. The director of the Air and Space Museum retired at 80. Okay, I'm not doing that, but you know, you get that freedom. I think what worries me is the vision of the museum is a vision that says, how do you use African American culture as a lens to understand what it means to be an American, right? That's the key that I think was different. My worry is, how do I make sure that long after I'm gone, that notion's still embedded in there, that people don't run away from that notion? I think the other thing is, candidly, in this political environment, the Smithsonian has always been fairly well protected within the federal government. That's a new era. And trying to figure out how do I, so for example, in our fundraising, I was so focused on getting this building built that I said to my staff, no endowment. Now we've got to look at endowment and figure out how do we make sure we protect it. And I guess the other thing that keeps me awake is I really want us to be a museum that matters. And that means taking risks. It's taking stances on things that other museums don't do. And I worry about how do I protect the institution, the museum, at the same time we're going to take those risks. So those things keep me up at night. And I guess the last thing that keeps me up is that I really want this museum to help the Smithsonian become the 21st century institution it deserves to be. So those things keep me up at night.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh, please.